The art of warfare developed more rapidly in the 20th century than in the preceding 3 millennia of recorded history. The main reason for this was the marriage of innovative military thinking to an unprecedented advance in technology. In the 1920s, the Germans, prevented from maintaining large field armies, developed a new concept of warfare. This relied more upon speed and surprise than on material superiority. The dive bomber, the Panzer, and the Fallschirmjäger, the paratrooper, were the key elements of this new kind of warfare. The Germans were the first nation to use paratroopers in combat. Their inventiveness and daring helped bring about spectacular success for Nazi Germany in the first 2 years of the Second World War. Fortunately for the Allies, the full potential of the Fallschirmjäger was not realized. In 1941, Hitler decided that their day was over and the paratroopers were confined to the ground. Ironically, the Allies, who'd suffered at the hands of German airborne forces, were racing ahead with their own plans to develop parachute units. The idea of airborne troops was first proposed by American General Billy Mitchell. Mitchell suggested dropping several battalions of infantry behind enemy lines during World War I. But the armistice came before anything could come of the notion. It was not until 1927 that Italy experimented with the concept. And by 1930, Mussolini had at least 2 trained parachute battalions. The Soviets also saw the value of parachute troops and started experimenting with the idea in 1928. By the middle of the 1930s, the Red Army was mounting massed parachute drops. Methods were still crude. The paratroops crawled out of the aircraft onto the wing before jumping together and immediately pulling their ripcords. This was far from safe, but did result in a tight concentration on the drop zone. In one demonstration in 1936, 1,000 troops were dropped, quickly followed by another 2,500 soldiers together with their heavy weapons. The combined formation then carried out conventional infantry attacks, covered by fire from heavy machine guns, mortars, and light artillery. One downside to the Russian model was the slow speed of the aircraft. To avoid the jumpers being ripped from the wings by the airflow, transports had to fly right at the edge of stalling. Slow speeds reduced the element of surprise and made the aircraft incredibly vulnerable to ground fire. Many foreign observers were present at the Russian exercise, including British Major General Archibald Wavell, who said, "If I had not seen it for myself, I should have not thought it possible." As with many innovations, it is rarely the inventor who profits from the final product. The Russians and the Italians might have been the pioneers, but it was Germany that really made use of airborne warfare's potential. Hermann Goering, head of the Reich's newly unveiled Air Force, had also been present at the Russian paratroop demonstration. The flamboyant former fighter ace was enthusiastic. He was always looking for new methods of self-publicity, both to bring himself to Hitler's attention and to gain a temporary advantage over his rivals within the Nazi party. Like some medieval barons, the Nazi chiefs had been developing their own armies. Stormtrooper leader Ernst Röhm had recently been murdered, along with the leadership of the Sturmabteilung. Heinrich Himmler's SS had been instrumental in bringing down Rome's private army, and it expanded to fill the vacuum. Goering, never one to be outdone, had created a paramilitary police force in Prussia. With the introduction of general conscription in March 1935, the unit was redesignated the Regiment Hermann Goering. On the 1st of October 1935, Goering transferred the unit to the new Luftwaffe, and it was from this force that he called for the first airborne volunteers. The airborne units would fit well into the German concept of Blitzkrieg, a new type of warfare that was being developed in the 1930s. The key to Blitzkrieg was the premise that it was simpler, easier, and cheaper to destroy an opponent's armed forces by cutting off its supplies or by severing its lines of communication and control than by frontal assaults. Allied to this were the elements of speed and shock. On the ground, armored spearheads would punch through an enemy's point of least resistance, then fanning out behind the lines to create the maximum disruption. The use of airborne troops to seize key points ahead of armored units fitted obviously into the strategy. By September 1939, the Germans could field the world's first fully equipped and superbly trained parachute division. From the start, the Fallschirmjäger was seen as an elite identified by their special uniforms and training. The image was cultivated by the recruiters, and the glamorous new warriors were paraded throughout Germany. Paratroopers were presented as being part of a brave new world, which was turning conventional military tactics on its head. Recruiters warned that the specialized training would put great physical, spiritual, and moral demands on an individual. But the product would be the Führer's airborne stormtroopers jumping for the glory of the Reich. Thousands bought into the dream. One of these was Max Schmeling, the heavyweight boxing champion, who had volunteered for the Corps. A national hero in Germany, he was often featured in paratroop recruiting films. The quality of the volunteers was high, but then, so were the standards they were expected to achieve. The backbone of any military force is always the men. The Germans took particular care with the selection of their recruits. From the start, both officers and men were treated alike in training. All took the same risks, faced the same tests. All ranks were volunteers, coming from existing units, and were therefore trained soldiers at the outset. The parachute force was viewed as some sort of marine force with wings. And just as Marines live and fight alongside the Navy, so did the Fallschirmjäger live and fight alongside the Luftwaffe. When the initial volunteers were trained in 1936, the link with flying was so strong that the first batch of officers were put through the full pilot's course, the normal Luftwaffe practice, before they ever approached the parachute school. In action, they helped to refuel planes at forward airstrips. They were used as ground crew, loading containers, hitching up gliders, and even marshalling aircraft around the perimeter. The Luftwaffe quickly caught on to the fact that by imposing a rigorous training regime and rejecting 2/3 of all applicants, which was the usual failure rate, they automatically advertised themselves as an elite. That the paratroopers were tough goes without saying. It was part of their training to produce a soldier who was as hard and flexible as steel. He was self-reliant, aggressive, and capable of independent thought. His training inculcated the Fallschirmjäger with the belief that he was the pick of German youth, a claim with some degree of truth up until 1942. Eager young men came forward in droves to volunteer for the arduous training program. They reported to the parachute training school at Stendal in Bavaria. The first 3 months of training were spent in refining infantry skills, concentrating on unarmed combat and the use of captured enemy weapons. There was great emphasis placed upon physical training, marching, and agility. In the latter half of the course, the recruit learned aircraft drills, and in particular, the unusual headlong dive that was used to leave the Junkers Ju-52, the standard paratrooper platform throughout the war. Recruits then went through a 16-day parachute course, in which they packed their own parachutes and completed 6 jumps. The course was highly compressed, so much so in fact that it required the novice to learn far too much in too short a time. After completing the course, the recruit received his parachute badge, a diving eagle surrounded by a wreath, which he wore on his formal uniform. He would not, however, have carried out a night jump, nor would he have acquired much practice in the vital requirements of rallying on the drop zone, or of packing containers. These lessons were taught once he reached his operational unit. The Germans produced the widest possible range of dedicated and modified items for their airborne troops. In combat, Fallschirmjäger stood out from the ordinary Wehrmacht formations around them. The first and most striking difference was the helmet. This was a standard German coal scuttle with the rim cut down, designed to prevent snagging on the parachute lines. Inside it, it was thickly padded with foam rubber. It carried the Luftwaffe eagle on the left side facing forward. The remainder of the uniform was loose cut. The trousers were very full, with button pockets on the sides running almost down to the knee. There was a snap-fastening internal pocket below the right knee, which contained a folding knife. This was to be used for cutting loose the parachute harness when being dragged by a strong wind. Dragging was an ever-present danger with the standard RZ-16 parachute. This had a cumbersome buckled harness, and recruits were trained to get out of it while being blown across the airfield by propeller wash of tethered aeroplanes. In difficult circumstances, the parachutists were allowed to cut the 2 suspension ropes running to their waist. The trousers were tied around the ankle with tapes and tucked into the tops of the boots. These came high on the calf for ankle support, and they had thick rubber soles. The combat smock was almost as much a symbol of the Fallschirmjäger as the rimless helmet. The early smocks were plain grey or grey-green. Later, smocks were camouflaged in various patterns, but plain smocks were still in evidence at the end of the war. When jumping, the smock was worn over the uniform and combat webbing to keep the parachute rigging from snagging. Once on the ground, the combat gear was placed over the smock, and removing the smock to put it under the gear was an aggravation in training and a dangerous delay in combat. In an effort to emphasize the special role of the parachute troops, the Luftwaffe authorized a special parade dress. It consisted of a jump overall worn over a shirt, collar and tie, and a parachute harness without the chute pack. The soldier wore the normal Wehrmacht leather boots with this uniform, these being more suited to marching. In spite of the advanced nature of much of the equipment, German Fallschirmjäger was saddled with the worst parachutes employed by any major power during World War II. Based on the Italian Salvatore design, the German RZ series of chutes had a single strap between the back of the body harness and the chute. This resulted in a face-down position, which required knee and elbow pads and a forward roll upon landing. This led to many injuries. To allow for proper deployment, the paratrooper had to leap forward in a straight body dive when jumping. Control during the descent was almost impossible, except for a superbly trained and agile trooper, and even then, little control was possible. The employment of this type of parachute is curious, since German aircrew used a chute which had lift webs attached to the shoulders, like the British and American models. The forward roll landing also prevented the parachutist from carrying much equipment on his body. Except for pistols, grenades, and the occasional submachine gun, German paratroopers had to rely on containers for their main combat equipment. A single 40-man platoon of Fallschirmjäger needed no less than 14 containers, just for weapons and basic ammunition supply. The containers were carried either under the wings or in the bomb bays of supporting aircraft. Each container could hold over 200 pounds of equipment, and a maximum loaded weight was 260 pounds. It was 5 feet long and about 16 inches square. The container had a crash pad at one end, and the parachute was connected to the other end. The number one priority of the troops upon landing was to find their containers. Colored bands or other markings were used to aid retrieval by the correct units and to indicate which items the container carried. The delay imposed by the need to find equipment containers was a severe handicap. It led to the virtual extinction of 2 units on Crete when they dropped onto defended positions. But the Fallschirmjäger did benefit from some of the most advanced weapons types in service by any army throughout World War II. The most famous item was the FG-42, a powerful automatic rifle made only for the paratroopers. Only about 10,000 were made. Most German paratroopers were armed with MP-3840 submachine guns or with bolt-action Mauser rifles. Late in the war, many Fallschirmjäger were issued with the MP-44 Sturmgewehr. This was the forerunner of the modern assault rifles. But it only went into mass production in 1944, and supply never came close to equaling demand. German airborne troops were equipped with what were undoubtedly the best machine guns of World War II. The original MG-34 was replaced by the stamped steel MG-42, which was easier and cheaper to produce. It had a phenomenal rate of fire of 1,300 to 1,400 rounds per minute. The Germans never came up with a lightweight air-dropped or transportable vehicle to equal the Allies' Jeep. They did use motorcycles, usually 750cc BMWs equipped with sidecars for reconnaissance. The motorcycles also had a towing hook, so they could pull light artillery weapons. However, towing strength for such a combination was low and cross-country performance poor. The Fallschirmjäger also made limited use of the Kettenrad, an ingenious semi-track vehicle based on a motorcycle. The Kettenrad had a motorcycle wheel in front and a track on each side of the rear. With a 1500cc engine and a weight of 1,200 kilograms, it had better cross-country performance than a motorcycle. It was usually transported in a glider, as it was difficult to load and unload from a Ju-52. There were 3 main methods of bringing airborne units into action. Parachute assaults were usually delivered by the Junkers Ju-52. This plane was the Fallschirmjäger workhorse and was affectionately known as Iron Annie or Auntie Junkers. The slab-sided trimotor had a crew of 2 or 3 and could carry 12 parachutists or 17 infantrymen, though in emergencies it was often overloaded. Air landing troops also used Ju-52s. They were usually follow-up troops, flown into action after the glider and parachute troops had secured a suitable airfield or landing strip. These were often army troops intensively trained and equipped for transportation by air. Glider delivery was important. Gliders were used in most theaters, particularly for landing paratroops into Sicily and also in a resupply role to surrounded pockets on the Eastern Front. The DFS-230 carried 10 soldiers, taking off on a wheeled undercarriage which was jettisoned once in the air. It landed on a skid. The Gotha GO-242 was introduced in 1942. A twin-boom medium assault glider, the Gotha offered 3 times the capacity of the DFS-230. It could carry a crew of 2 and up to 21 fully equipped troops, or the equivalent weight in stores and equipment. The wings were made of wood with a fabric covering. Fuselage, which was positioned centrally, was made of tubular steel covered with fabric. Cargo was loaded through the rear fuselage, which hinged upwards. The 242 saw service in the Mediterranean and North Africa, but was only used in 2 Fallschirmjäger operations. It ferried men of the 1st Parachute Division from southern France to Sicily in July 1943, and in July 1944 flew reinforcements and equipment into southern France. The towing aircraft was normally a Heinkel HE-111, but Junkers Ju-87s, Henschel HS-126s, and Dornier Do-17s were also used as glider tugs. The idea for a giant glider was born during the preparations for the invasion of England, when the need to get men and materials across the Channel in a hurry was paramount. At the time of its production, the Messerschmitt 321 was the 2nd largest aircraft in the world and was capable of transporting over 100 troops or 19 tons of stores and equipment. A powered version, the 323, was produced later in the war. Both variants were easy prey for enemy aircraft, and they were finally reduced to behind-the-lines flying. Following the Austrian Anschluss in March 1938, the Germans began to prepare for the takeover of Czechoslovakia. The planned operation would give the Infant Airborne Arm its first opportunity to shine. Airborne planning was the responsibility of General Major Kurt Student, who assembled the 1st Air Assault Division. Although Germany won Czechoslovakia without a fight, Student had the 16th Infantry Regiment air-landed into open fields near their objectives in Moravia as an exercise. This took place on the 1st of October 1938 and was entirely successful. Through the next year, Student continued to carry out exercises to mold his fledgling forces. These culminated in a 1,000-man drop in July 1939. Airborne troops were briefed for a number of operations in the Polish campaign, but the rapid advance of the armored divisions made them unnecessary. In April 1940, the Fallschirmjäger finally made their combat debut in the invasions of Scandinavia. The aim in both Denmark and Norway was to overwhelm resistance by bold initial strokes. By making defense appear hopeless, Danes and Norwegians were to be encouraged to accept the invader. By quickly occupying the ports and airfields, British assistance was to be excluded. Just 1 parachute battalion was made available. It had orders to drop 1 company, less a platoon, to seize the bridge linking Copenhagen with its ferry terminal. The spare platoon was to be dropped at Aalborg to capture 2 airfields. Meanwhile, in Norway, a company was to be dropped at Sola Airfield Stavanger. The remainder of the unit was to seize Fornebu Field, Oslo. At all the captured landing grounds, follow-up infantry were to be landed, while at the same time the Navy would bring more troops ashore through ports. At Fornebu, thick cloud had forced the aircraft to turn back, and the Junkers loaded with infantry began landing in the face of direct fire. They suffered casualties. Escorting fighter bombers running short of fuel landed and trained their guns on the defenders. Somehow, chaos was turned into victory as the operation continued and the defenders gave up. Within hours, as a disarming psychological ploy, a German military band was leading troops into Oslo. Soon, the whole of southern Norway was in German hands at relatively small cost, justifying the risks taken. The German decision to use the Fallschirmjäger in Norway, successful though it was, may have been a mistake. The price of using airborne troops in Scandinavia revealed to the world the tactics of seizing airfields by small parachute assaults, and then using these fields to accept large numbers of air-landed reinforcements. The next major operation was the May 1940 campaign in Holland. Generalleutnant Student's 7th Air Division made a series of battalion-strength jumps. Fallschirmjäger Regiment FJR-1 seized the 2 bridges at Murdick and the bridges at Dordrecht and Walhaven. This gave German forces a fast route across rivers and flooded land into the core of the Dutch defenses. At the same time, German paratroopers launched an extraordinary operation against the fortress of Eben-Emael in Belgium. This massive concrete structure covered key bridges across the Elbe Canal at Caen, Vroonhoven and Veldvezelt. At dawn on the 10th of May, 10 gliders were released at 8,000 feet while still inside Germany and glided in total silence to land on their Belgian targets just as dawn was breaking. They landed within the fortress perimeter. Surprise was complete. Using shaped explosive charges, the attackers penetrated the armored casements housing the fort's heavy artillery. The defenders stood little chance and were trapped in their subterranean tunnels, unable to strike back. At a cost of 6 killed and 20 wounded, the Fallschirmjäger held the fortress for 24 hours before being relieved by the 61st Infantry Division. The glider-borne troops had effectively neutralized the 700-strong Belgian army garrison and so opened the route for German ground forces to push into France and Belgium. Glider-borne troops and paratroops also seized the bridges across the Albert Canal. The next major parachute operations came a year later in Greece. On the 25th of April, 1941, the reinforced FJR-2 under Obersturm was tasked with the capture of the bridge across the Corinth Canal that separated the southern Peloponnese from the rest of Greece. A mixed force of gliders and paratroops captured the bridge before it could be demolished. The German airborne forces suffered only 8 killed, but they were to be cheated of their objective. A stray shell or bullet triggered the demolition charges attached to the bridge and dropped it into the canal. But this was only the prologue. The main act and the paratroopers' greatest test came the following month. In May 1941, 13,000 paratroops of the 7th Air Division under Generalleutnant Kurt Student and 9,000 men of the 5th Mountain Division under Generalmajor Julius Ringel were committed to the capture of the island of Crete. They were supported by 500 fighters and bombers, 500 transports and 80 gliders. Crete was held by 28,000 British and Commonwealth troops, with a further 14,500 Greek regular and irregular troops. Though the Allied forces were poorly equipped, many had been recently evacuated from mainland Greece, they had a major advantage over their adversaries. Britain's ultra codebreakers had given the Allied commander, Major General Bernard Freyberg, a complete breakdown of the German plans. Ultra intelligence had earlier allowed the British to withdraw successfully from Greece. The German assault on Crete, codenamed Operation Mercury, divided the island into 4 drop zones. From Malami in the west, through Hania, to Retimo and Heraklion in the east. Lack of transport aircraft meant that the island was attacked in 2 waves, in the morning and in the afternoon of May the 20th. Group West, under Generalmajor Eugen Meindl, was the first wave, landing in the Malami-Hania drop zone. In the afternoon, Group Center, under Generalmajor Sussman, landed at Retimo. At the same time, Generalleutnant Julius Ringel's Group East, spearheaded by paratroops of FJR-1 and a battalion of FJR-2, attacked the airfield at Heraklion to allow the 5th Mountain Division to be landed by Ju-52s. The response of the Imperial and Greek forces to the German attacks was violent and effective. Those men who had landed at Retino and Heraklion suffered heavily and were effectively bottled up. Only at Melanie Airfield did the paratroops manage to find cover and set up a viable base in the dried-up riverbed of the River Tavronitis. The key feature, a hill known as Point 107, which dominated the airfield, was held by the New Zealand 22nd Battalion. Under pressure and without reliable communications, they pulled back. This gave the Germans their opening. With an airfield in their possession, they poured in reinforcements. The island fell to the Germans, but the airborne forces suffered very heavy losses. 4,000 killed, 2,000 wounded, and 220 aircraft were destroyed. Among the losses was a convoy of Greek fishing vessels carrying heavy equipment, which was intercepted at night by the Royal Navy and sunk. Hitler declared that the day of the paratrooper is over, and with these words, he condemned his elite force for the rest of the war to serve in a ground role. Not for the first time, Hitler had made a strategic error. The paratroopers could have brought victory for Germany in the Mediterranean had they been used in a proposed invasion of Malta. Instead, that heroic island remained a bastion for the Royal Navy, which continued its harrying operations against the German and Italian Marines, so depriving Rommel of vital supplies which he needed in his final drive on Alexandria. As elite ground forces, the Fallschirmjäger fought in North Africa and on the Eastern Front. They defended Sicily and Italy, notably at Monte Cassino, and fought in Normandy, Holland, and in the final defense of Eastern Europe. In many of those campaigns, the German airborne soldiers found themselves fighting British and American paratroopers, who had landed to secure beachheads or bridges. German paratroopers will forever be associated with their fighting defense of the fortress town of Monte Cassino, where they held off wave upon wave of Allied attacks between December 1943 and May 1944. They fought and died in the cellars and ruins. Hitler paid tribute to the Fallschirmjäger during the fight for Monte Cassino, saying they were harder than the Waffen-SS. Their stubborn defense of the monastery town delayed the Allied advance in Italy by several months and demonstrated their esprit de corps and tenacity in battle. As a mark of respect for their opponents, the Allies christened them the Green Devils of Cassino. On the 12th of September 1943, paratroops of the 1st Company of the Fallschirmjäger Lehr Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant von Berlapsch and a small group of Waffen-SS men under Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny, were carried in 12 DFS 230 gliders to rescue the Italian leader Benito Mussolini. Following his arrest by the Italian authorities, the former leader had been held in a remote hotel on the Gran Sasso Plateau near Rome. Since the hotel could only be reached by a funicular railway, airborne assault was the only viable option. 8 of the gliders reached the rocky landing zone and Mussolini was rescued. Skorzeny and the Duce made their exit in a hazardous flight in a Fiesler Storch observation aircraft. On the 12th of November 1943, a force of 500 paratroops of the 1st Battalion FJR-2 were used in the Aegean, where they led a sea and air assault on the island of Leros, garrisoned by British and Italian troops. They were dropped onto a bone-dry area, strewn with boulders and bisected by gullies. The slow-flying Ju-52s took heavy ground fire, and the paratroopers had suffered 40% casualties before they had even jumped. On the drop zone, broken limbs accounted for a further 20%. However, once on the ground, the British reported them to be tough opponents. The paratroops were reinforced with subsequent drops of men and equipment during the campaign, which resulted in an unexpected British defeat. On the night of the 15th of December 1944, as part of the German offensive in the Ardennes, a reinforced battalion of 1,200 men from FJR 6 parachuted behind American lines near Malmedy. The battalion was dropped by inexperienced pilots and scattered, and though it caused some concern, made little contribution to the main offensive. Fallschirmjäger continued to be used as ground troops until the close of the war, but the Ardennes was the last airborne attack. The later history of the German Parachute Corps, with its confusing number of divisions, rather detracts from the dynamic and impressive early years. The real reason for the virtual disappearance of the airborne arm was the invasion of Russia. Not only were experienced men lost on the Eastern Front, but so also were transport aircraft and their pilots. The parachute divisions were then used as high-class light infantry, a well-trained, all-volunteer force who could quickly be moved to threatened parts of the front, but who took little heavy equipment or support weapons with them. They were an ideal force to plug gaps, but not one to sustain prolonged operations. When the High Command broke this fundamental rule at Leningrad and in Normandy, the parachutists suffered terrible losses. After 1943, the divisions were parachute in name only, and could never have repeated the Crete operation. But they continued to fight with professionalism and determination. Despite their dispiriting finale, the founders of the German Parachute Corps must be given credit. They possessed the foresight, drive, and courage to form the world's first airborne army, and they imbued it with a spirit which matched the highest of standards. The German Fallschirmjäger set an example which others, both friend and foe, had to follow.